But let's start with what are the questions around this technology? I will admit at times for the next 30 or so minutes, I might sound a little doom and gloomy. That's not my intention. But I do think as we begin to consider how our students will use this technology, how we might in our research and our teaching, we need to do so with our eyes open about what is likely to come and how this technology has come to be. Also, I'm a big believer in transparency, so I will just admit to you all, nearly all of the images in my slides today were generated at least in part with AI. None of the text was, and none of my remarks were, but I do want to just note that use. And so we'll start with two of those. This represents some of the hope and fear about where we'll go. One of my side hobbies, I like to create and make things. I make t-shirts, stickers, posters, and one of my things I love most is to recreate old propaganda posters for contemporary problems or issues. That is painstaking labor, that is hand-drawn, takes a while, and that's the fun of it. But for these purposes, I did ask ChatGPT to help me with that. And I think this captures some of what the hope is. It can help our productivity. It can do things faster than we're able to. But there's also then that risk that if it can make good things, it can make some very bad things. And so we live somewhere in the spectrum of these two posters. Another one that my friend and chair, Sam Sendacook, said I had to include was this piece from McSweeney's, a company reminder for everyone to talk nicely about the giant plagiarism machine. We'll learn more about why it's a plagiarism machine in a bit. But I think that we are in a weird moment of trying to figure out how do we even talk about or to this technology. And so I just love the line, I'd like to remind you that our company policy is pro-plagiarism machine. What a line to bring us in today. When we use AI, we have immense opportunity for things to go very well and to really increase the quality and depth of the work we do. But it's also important to remember AI can fail. This was the result of trying to make an oil painting of my dog using ChatGPT. I'm a Boston Terrier lover. They're great dogs, the best dogs in the world. Sorry if you have others. And something clearly went wrong, but this also might be the most creative piece of AI art I've seen because it wasn't what I asked for and it wasn't what it was supposed to do, and yet here we are. So we have to be ready for the pitfalls and the opportunities as we go. And as part of that, we see a lot of both hype and doom. On one side, I hear so much about the promise of AI. Now, in particular, that emerges from two places: companies that are selling AI products and folks that are hoping to integrate AI products into their work to reduce labor costs. More on that in a sec. The hype around the promise of AI is that it is exponential, and it will fundamentally alter the way we interact in our world, with promises about its ability to deliver utopia, to free us from the mundane tasks of our day and offer us more time for leisure, to be more thoughtful and engaged people. That's the hope. On the other side is the fear of dystopia now. The rise of Skynet, potentially, the death of education in the university. After all, how do we teach students when it's so easy for them to steal or complete work without thinking critically? And, of course, the real climate impact of AI that we'll talk about in a moment that has the potential to speed along our coming climate crisis. The surge in energy use is a big deal and something we have to think about and be responsible for. This potential for doom led one commentator, Eric Hurl, to name this the semantic apocalypse. The semantic apocalypse heralded by AI is a kind of semantic satiation at the cultural level. For imitation, which is what these models ultimately do best, is a form of repetition at mass scale. And so art, all of it, I mean the entire human artistic endeavor, becomes a thing satiated, stripped of meaning, pure syntax. This is what I fear most about AI. Culture following the same collapse as community on the back of worrying compute surplus of imitated power produced by Silicon Valley. Hurl's criticism is that because this is primarily about imitation, what is lost is the humanness, the spirit of creativity. The work of AI in the mechanical age poses some threats to what is uniquely human. And at some point, things are iterative, right? Painters start by learning basic tools, copying techniques. When we write, we often write in the style of those we like best until we find our own voice. So this is not new, but when we turn over our labor to something other than ourselves, we do run the risk of losing what makes us human. And as a university dedicated to things like Cura Personalis, about the value of human dignity, and about the importance, purpose, and drive of engaging with our students, that's labor and love that we cannot outsource. Before we dive in, I'll give just a little bit about how generative AI works, because I think this is something that is hard to wrap your mind around sometimes. I'll start with our focus today is primarily around generative AI. Those are the systems where you put text in and you get something out, whether it's an image, text, a whole essay, music, video, and that is a more narrow element of the kind of larger world of artificial intelligence. Part of the problem is that artificial intelligence has become almost meaningless because we apply it to everything. You can stroll down to Costco and get yourself an electric toothbrush with AI built in, so you can use their app to give you guided tips on better brushing for your teeth. It's not really artificial intelligence, but it can be marketed as such. You can buy a dryer which uses advanced artificial intelligence to tell exactly when your clothes are dry. I think there's easier ways, but here we are. And it amounts to little more than an equation and a humidity sensor that is able to say, well, we're done. So we have this broad area, and we get swept up in the hype of putting AI into everything. And so we're going to focus a little more narrowly with a lot of our time today. And so I'm going to start with this slide that actually comes from a video that my colleague, Dr. Stephen Fernandez, shared. And when I play this, it's going to show you in real time exactly how generative AI generates. And if you don't know, these systems work one word at a time. So it's not thinking holistically, it is not producing a block of text, it is running the probability and statistics one by one. And if there's a lesson to take away, these systems right now are more math than creativity. They are based on probability and statistics. They are based on pattern matching and recognition. Okay. I don't know why that's so fast today, but that's all right. I'll talk through then. So what's happening here is for each word that it is supposed to use, it is going to run the probability of what each next word is going to be. And because it goes from one word to the next, it loses that larger comprehension of the whole that it has produced. Sometimes in our classrooms, we experience this when students do what we call compose at the keyboard. That is, they start the essay with the first word, they finish it with the last word, and what happens in between is unfortunately not always edited, revised, and thoughtfully whole. Now, many of our students are better than that. I'm not making fun of them. When I was an undergrad, I had this same problem. Imagine that on the level of every word without that more holistic sense. Because of that, for all of the magic, we must remember that it is not thinking, it's not reasoning, it is computing. That's not to denigrate it or to say that is bad. Lots of things in our world work that way. But as we hear promises about artificial general intelligence and we hear about neural networks and how these systems are designed to mimic the brain, at the end of the day, it is something that is calculated. From this report on MIT, when AI gets it wrong, addressing AI hallucination bias, they say, generative AI models function like advanced autocomplete tools. They're designed to predict the next word or sequence based on observed patterns. The goal is to generate plausible content, not to verify its truth. This means any accuracy in the output is often coincidental. As a result, they might produce content that sounds reasonable, but is inaccurate. And that's frustrating. It's not unique to these machines. We are all surrounded by folks in our lives who produce things that sound plausible, but maybe aren't. But that nugget, that kernel of ultimate truth that should adhere what we do is not a guidepost of these machines. And they are machines. So with the time, the next half hour, I want to talk about what it means to say AI is technology, it is not intelligence, and then spend the bulk of it talking about the ethical controversies around AI. And I want to start, of all places, talking about the color ultramarine. Seems weird. From a really nice essay that is, I describe it as haunting, on AI, Scott Alexander talks about the process in the medieval age of getting the color ultramarine. And I'm going to quote him at length. He describes it this way. First, go to Afghanistan. Keep in mind you start in England or France, wherever. Afghanistan is 4,000 miles away. Your path takes you through tall mountains, burning deserts, and several dozen Muslim countries. Note, many of these countries were hostile following the Crusades. Still alive? Climb 7,000 feet through the mountains of Kurwan until you reach the mines of Sari Sang. There, in a freezing desert, the wretched of the earth work themselves to an early grave, breaking apart the rocks of Badakhshan to mine a few hundred kilograms per year of stone, the only lapis lazuli produced in the known world. Buy the stone, and then retrace your path through the burning deserts until you're back in England or France or wherever. Still alive? That was the easy part. Now you need to go through a chemical extraction process that makes the philosopher's stone look like freshman chem lab. The lengthy process of pulverization, sifting, and washing to produce ultramarine makes the natural pigment roughly 10 times more expensive than the stone that it came from. Finally, you have ultramarine. In practice, the medievals converged on a single use case: painting the Virgin Mary's coat. In the 19th century, a German man named Christian Mellin discovered the process of producing synthetic ultramarine, and we were able to move its use beyond just Mary's coat. In the 1960s, French artist Yves Klein came up with a new synthetic ultramarine that he thought was even bluer. And today, with a quick query and 10 seconds later, ChatGPT can produce a color swatch of ultramarine, or produce that medieval painting of the Virgin Mary with her ultramarine coat. What I like about this story is it is a reminder that technology often makes some tasks easier and moves us to more difficult ones, but it also extracts us from our labor. The ability to have a computer and printer takes us way away from the tactile labor of the typewriter. The typewriter, then, was an innovation that came after the printing press that saved us the tedious work of handwriting manuscripts. And I know at least some of my colleagues have penmanship that would not have passed muster. And of course, the invention of the book itself took us away from the actual labor of memory, of memorization. In fact, in my own field of rhetoric, in classical rhetoric in our history, memory was considered one of the 5 most important skills to learn. We don't teach memory anymore as one of those skills. None of those things are bad, but we have moved from one method of labor and creativity to an altogether different one, and generative AI is part of that process and movement. Now, as the provost noted, as many of you probably feel, this technology creates some discord, some fear, some worry. That's okay. That's pretty common. In fact, if you look at the history of new technology, one of the things that you discover is that we often freak out when something new comes. A couple of examples of this. In the Phaedrus, Plato says this invention, talking about books, pen and paper, writing, will produce forgetfulness in the souls of those who have learned it. They will appear to be omniscient and will generally know nothing. I could have just said that to you all about generative AI, and it would have held. And while we have lost some things by the ability to write, we have gained so much more. And so we want to weigh that as we think about new technology. Likewise, the printed word. Printed books will never be the equivalent of handwritten codices. Printing brings about a laziness in learning. Well, when you talk to faculty about what they fear with generative AI, they talk about laziness in learning. One of my favorite examples is when the bicycle became mass adopted, medical professionals were concerned in particular about women who rode bikes, saying that the unconscious effort to maintain one's balance tends to produce a wearied and exhausted bicycle face. My colleague Adam Semberg rode his bike in today, and I do not see bicycle face on his face. Last, the dangers of phones. And by the way, this is not about cell phones. This is about the development of the landline phone. Some feared the telephone would erode face-to-face community and replace genuine human contact with disembodied voices. Also, a critique that we might apply to AI. This is technology, and I don't say that to leave the impression that that means it's not serious, that we don't have to worry about it. But also I think it's important to situate it in the context of our overall fear of technology, and that we will be adapting not just for a year, but for years to how this impacts the work we do. And we'll have to do that whether we want to or not. At least for myself, I cannot do what one of my colleagues said, which was, I'm going to ride it out till I retire in a couple of years. I got a couple decades left, so I don't have the luxury. So I want to turn to some of the larger ethical issues for just a little bit. And I've chosen this figure of the double helix because each of these issues is embedded in the DNA of generative AI. When we use it, we cannot forget this. We can't pretend that our narrow area, and I say that as someone who used AI to produce this image, you may find that distasteful or ironic, I accept it, that these things exist within it at every instance and every use. And I want to begin with what I often hear from both students and faculty as the number one concern around the rise of generative AI, and that's the environment. When we think about questions of the ethics and environmental costs of generative AI, we generally focus on three controversies: the energy and water consumption that it takes to train and run these. I'll give you some figures on that in just a moment. But these are energy powerhouses. We have seen attempts to bring shuttered nuclear reactors back online to power these servers. We have seen coal plants that have already been restarted even after they were brought offline, and new ones planned to be built to kind of keep up with these energy demands. And so there is a large cost to the energy that it takes. Oh, and by the way, when companies like Apple tout their use of renewable energy for all of their artificial intelligence work, we should remember that they accomplish that goal by buying up the renewable energy in the communities that their servers are in, leaving none left over for the folks who live there, meaning those are the folks that have to increase their carbon footprint because they don't have an option for renewable energy. Second, these systems, these computers, often make use of rare earth minerals that are mined in both environmentally damaging conditions and using incredibly poor labor practices, sometimes bordering on slavery. And all of our phones, the device in your pocket to the servers running generative AI, rely on those minerals. And then as the necessary computing power for all of these systems increases, we need to frequently replace the servers that run them. And the old ones very often end up in landfills, living out their days, leaching chemicals into the environment that surround them. So the environmental cost is serious and real, even as new models become more efficient and consume less power. To give you a sense of this change, there is a new report out from MIT that's quite wonderful, and they've done some of the work of calculating the environmental footprint, the energy footprint of AI. From 2005 to 2017, the amount of electricity going to data centers remained quite flat, thanks to an increase in efficiency, despite the construction of armies of new data centers to serve the rise of cloud-based online services from Facebook to Netflix. In 2017, AI began to change everything. Data centers began getting built with energy-intensive hardware designed for AI, which led them to double their electricity consumption by 2023. The latest report shows that 4.4% of all energy in the US goes towards data centers. We have to solve the energy consumption problem, and that's both an environmental concern and a practical one. This technology will remain expensive until it's cheaper to produce and use. I also should note that while that consumption is problematic, all of us that make use of any cloud service, any streaming platform, that use any smartphone device is sending and receiving data from these server farms and using some of that energy and consumption. We talk about it as the cloud as if it's far up in the air, but the reality is the cloud is a computer somewhere on a server farm running constantly and consuming energy. Quantifying how much energy these systems consume is difficult because we don't have great data. MIT tried to do the math, and I think it's really interesting to think about what they found. My favorite part of this is they converted the energy of using AI into the time it takes to run your microwave. I think that's a good metric. Because I have a 6-year-old who often does not like my delicious cooking, sometimes she ends up eating easy mac and cheese, so I have converted microwave time into bowls of easy mac and cheese for the parents out here. Let's start with the text query. A simple text query is the equivalent of, on average, running your microwave for 3 seconds. It's 0.01 bowls of easy mac and cheese. Generating a single image, we move that time to about 5.5 seconds. We're only at 0.02 bowls. Probably the biggest concern is the current rise of video generation because it is just much hungrier. Generating 3 5-second videos is the equivalent of running your microwave for an hour straight, allowing you to produce 13 bowls of Easy Mac for a hungry cadre of 6-year-olds. The issue is that all of these are single prompts, but when you start using AI, you don't get away with one prompt in most instances. You are doing more complex tasks. And so one of the things that MIT did was calculate a complex task. 10 text queries, 10 attempts at image generation, and 5 attempts at video generation. This complex task used enough power to power your microwave for 3 hours continuously, or 47 bowls of Easy Mac and Cheese. That's a lot of power and something that we should consider as we pour in prompt after prompt after prompt in our work. Now, we use power and we value power, so this energy consumption is part of how we see the technology, but I also believe that we have to weigh the costs and benefits as we go, especially as we integrate it in our work in more serious ways. The CEO of OpenAI, Sam Altman, who benefits by kind of underselling the environmental impact, recently said that a single query on ChatGPT is about the same as a Google search right now, and that lines up with what MIT found on the low end of some of these models. And so they are getting more energy efficient. The paradox is, as it becomes cheaper and more efficient, use will go up. And so it's not clear that we will save energy. And so we have to calculate if it's worth it. Second are the long-term social consequences that can come from some of these technologies. Now, I don't believe that all of these will come true, but I do believe that we have to recognize that right now there is already social harm being done. One, flooding the internet with AI-generated material that may or may not be true erodes our trust in what we hear and receive from other people. 404 Media, a publication that talks a lot about news and tech, and from my area of research, surveillance, talked about the current presidency as the AI slop presidency. That's not a slight on the current president, but it is a recognition that lots of what we encounter about him and about politics today is AI generated, and we don't know if it's true. Second, for my health folks in here, and I know there are a lot of you, we have an issue with scope of practice. A number of companies have already started up, and some individuals using it for this on their own, the practices of generative AI therapy. You're getting mental health advice and conversation from generative AI, from ChatGPT, as opposed to a trained and licensed provider. I worry about that. I worry that they don't have the right guardrails. In a similar problem, we've seen the rise of AI friends, of folks turning to chatbots to provide company, companionship that they're having trouble finding in their own lives. We've heard a lot about the rise of loneliness in our society, and unfortunately some are turning to AI with disastrous consequences. There have been a number of cases like this, but in the example from Sewell Seltzer, he had engaged for months with an AI chatbot that he named Daenerys Targaryen after a character in Game of Thrones. He had stepped away from most of his real-world friends and come dependent on his conversations with Dany. He was isolated, he was sad, he was depressed, and began talking about suicidal ideation with the chatbot. There were no stops, there were no moments where it said, you should consult professional help. It didn't have the ability to call or reach out for help on his behalf. And as a result, unfortunately, he took his own life. I wish this was the only case. So when I say that our students need guidance, in part, we need to help them understand how this can be used and how it can be dangerous. A third problem is misinformation and hallucination. When I said that it's statistics, we should remember that these tools are designed to produce the most probable answer. So if it doesn't know the answer, it will give you what is probably the answer, regardless of if it's true. One of the textbooks I use in my critical issues class on surveillance and privacy that I teach to first-year students has a book that is not available online yet. It has yet to be consumed into OpenAI. And to see what it would produce, I kept asking it to give me quotations from the first chapter of the book. Give me the most important quotations. And it dutifully produced list after list of quotations, even got the quotation marks right, even gave me page numbers. Not a single one was in the book. And when I pushed it a little, it finally admitted, well, they're in the style of what that person would write. And I said, okay, all right, okay. Okay, don't do that again, just give me real quotes. Produced more quotes. Not there. And that's because these machines are primarily designed to give answers even if it doesn't know. They are the ultimate yes man. They don't think about, unless there is a clear guardrail, like don't produce dangerous content, to say no. They deliver what is probable. And because of that, they become unreliable. And this problem of hallucination, of creating false but convincing products, is that it isn't fixable. It's inherent in the mismatch between the technology and the proposed use cases, according to Dr. Emily Bender. MIT goes on, since these models mimic patterns in their training data without discerning truth, they can reproduce any falsehoods or biases present in the data. Meaning when we ask it for answers and we share those answers, we can unwittingly be the person spreading that misinformation that we want our students to learn to stop through careful, critical thinking. Number 4, the issue that I worry about the most: bias and fairness. A lot of these systems are trained by scraping text all over the internet. Now, I don't know if you spend a lot of time online, but there are pockets and corners where the writing is not the best. And garbage in, garbage out. If your training data is not good, your product won't be good. One of the interesting conversations around the integration of AI into higher ed is the argument that if AI can do it, that should be the bar for a C. And to get any grade higher, students have to outperform AI. I think it's an interesting argument. But it also is a reminder that because it's about probability, the responses are at best average. Also, the internet is a very, very, very bad place. Very bad. One of my research areas looks at the spread of white supremacist rhetoric online and how there are groups that purposely try and infiltrate websites and comment sections to try and persuade other folks who would otherwise reject racist ideas into becoming explicitly racist, moving to more extreme positions. Probably the lowest point in my research, because it was just depressing to read page after page after page of anti-Black and anti-Semitic rhetoric. That text, too, is part of the training data that some of these systems use. And so it has the ability to reproduce that material, and we should worry about that. Also, many of us don't know how these systems work. Some of the big companies have proprietary models, meaning they won't tell us what their algorithm is, they won't tell us the weights they use. But even for systems that are open source and we can explore the models ourselves, the vast majority of us lack the technical expertise to even know what that means. And so we should be careful turning over parts of our life to technology that we don't fundamentally get how it works. I love this quotation from Dr. Cathy O'Neil in her book, Weapons of Math Destruction. Big data processes codify the past. They do not invent the future. Doing that requires moral imagination, and that's something only humans can provide. We have to explicitly embed better values into our algorithms. We can produce that more hopeful future, but the issue of bias and fairness exists and puts us at risk if we don't intentionally think about how we're using these and the potential pitfalls that they produce. One recent study assigned personas to ChatGPT and asked it to engage in questions. When it told it to be a bad guy, to have a problematic persona, the increase in toxic text that it spit out increased up to 6 times. It engaged in incorrect stereotypes, harmful dialogue, and hurtful opinions. Worse, it did so narrowing in on particular groups. It didn't just pick anyone to spew hate about. And so this hatred, this bias, is at times just built into what these machines do. Next, consent, privacy, and transparency. There are a couple of issues here that run together. One of the first ones is that private data could end up in the text, the files that train these systems. We have been sloppy for the last couple years, decade probably at this point, of sharing personal things online. Things on Facebook, on other forms of social media, that while we don't think of as public, may have had a public audience. And those images, those thoughts have been swept up in some of these systems. And so unintentionally, private parts of our lives meant for a small network of friends, 10, 20, or for some of us who have a large network of friends, a few hundred, that information could end up there. Second, we don't know every time when we're interacting with generative AI technology. And so disclosure represents a problem. Should we be told when we're using generative AI? Should we know when we're interacting with it? Recently, a story came out about an interview that went poorly. It was a Zoom interview with a static picture, and it seemed like the interviewer maybe was a real person, a little bit odd in how they phrased things, until it spent a few minutes saying the same phrase in German over and over and over again, exposing that first round interview was in fact conducted by AI. There's already research that suggests, and I recognize this having already told you, I use generative AI to make these images, that when our peers and colleagues, our coworkers know that we are using this technology, their estimation of our worth, competence, and intelligence decreases because there's still a stigma around this use. Unfortunately, if that's the effect, folks may be less likely to say that they're using it. One of the things I worry a lot about is if we start throwing data into these systems, we risk it being compromised. So companies that rolled this out have already seen some of their proprietary data that they didn't want public, like salary information, showing up in unrelated queries because it had been ingested by the system. So whatever data you put in, remember that there is always that risk that it might become public or shared beyond your desire or means. And then the worst of the worst for me is the ability to generate images has already led to increasing problems around deepfake pornography. If you don't know what deepfakes are, it is the ability to put someone's face on an otherwise existing image or create images that have never existed before of them. Now, it might be fun to create an image of you hanging off the Eiffel Tower, but because the internet is a very, 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 very bad place, we have already seen this used to target people by creating fake nude images of them and sharing them. A source on this that I wish I was not citing is the American Academy of Pediatrics, which says, also, if a child's face is involved in deepfake pornography, they may face harm to their reputation, lower performance at school, and decreasing confidence about the future and available opportunities due to worries that the images will be permanently available online, even though this content is fake. Lest you think this is a small problem, this technology is in its infancy and is just now becoming more widely available. And yet 1 in 8 young people aged 13 to 20 and 1 in 10 teenagers aged 13 to 10 said they personally know someone who has been the target of deepfake nude imagery, and 1 in 17 has been the target themselves. 13% of teenagers said they knew someone who has used AI to create or redistribute deepfake pornography of minors. For all the promise and the fun images, there is this lingering concern about its effect. 2 more, then we'll. Labor, authorship, and intellectual property. One of the things is that there is this promise with this technology to free us from the drudgery of work. Writing boring reports that people don't read, automating tasks within spreadsheets, the things that we are supposed to not like and want to turn over. However, if you look at the history of automation and new technology in society, almost always it comes with this promise of freeing us from the drudgery of work. But capitalism is creative, and it finds new drudgery. With automation, with new technology, we find that the expectations of productivity increase, the demands for quality increase, and that promised leisure time never materializes. Workers are more productive today than at any point in history, and I'll note that wages have not kept up with that increase in productivity. And so if we are just replacing some work with more work, and for the average employee the net benefit is 0, that's a problem. One of the most puzzling things around AI as a communication person is who's the author of this content? Who's speaking? We know that you cannot copyright purely AI output. You have to change it in some way to make it your own. But we don't know who is speaking. Is it the person who entered the prompt? Is it the person who coded the system? They controlled quite a bit. Is it the teeming masses of folks on the internet who produced the data that it was trained on? And it is unsettling for us to know that we don't know who to think of as the author, And because no two queries are ever the same, we can't go back and verify where it came from. Next is that lots of the data used to train these systems was stolen. It was scraped from the internet without explicit consent. In fact, the biggest threat at this moment to generative AI is lawsuits around copyright and whether or not the material that was used to train it can be considered copyrighted, and if so, that will fundamentally alter the models of these systems and will impact how they're used. It is hard to know whether we consider this stolen and copyrighted or not, but we should be aware that if we have published online anywhere, it is likely that we have trained AI without our knowledge. Last but not least here is exploitation of labor. One of the folks that I hear often most excited about the rise of generative AI are managers and CEOs because of their ability to use it to reduce workforce. Now, new technology puts people out of work. We know this. We don't have lamplighters anymore. It happens. There are changes. But as an institution, as a Catholic institution that is invested in the rights of workers and the dignity of work as part of Catholic social teaching, we should think about where dignity comes into play if technology is going to replace labor. Also, the tedious work of training, coding, and cleaning all of that training data is often outsourced to places with poor working conditions and cheaper labor, and that potential exploitation is swept up. Last but not least is issues of governance. This is the quickest because there's no horizon at the moment for good AI governance. I've been teaching about surveillance and privacy here at Creighton for over a decade, and every year I've made the argument that there will not be a new regulatory framework for data consumption that will save us. So far, I've been right. AI is going to continue that effort, in part because these companies spend quite a bit of money lobbying to avoid such regulation. In the most recent back and forth of the appropriations bill, an original proposal was watered down, but what it has left with is a bar on any state law regulating artificial intelligence for the next decade. And if they pass those laws, they would lose all access to federal tech funding. There is not only not an appetite for regulation and control, for governance, but there is one that is actively resisting that. And lest you think that that emerges from one political party or another, I would remind you that we have been ping-ponging back and forth between parties and control of Congress for quite a while, and this has not changed. So these are the ethical issues embedded in the DNA of generative AI, and ones, as we think about using it, we need to cope with. I don't cover these to make you feel bad about using it or to create a sense of shame. That's not what I'm doing. There are risks, there are controversies, and there are downsides to every technological innovation. I do want us to be on the same page and be comfortable with the reality of some of these costs as we use this technology, as we think about adopting it.